Testing, testing, testing. 1, 2, 3. Okie dokie. Welcome to This and That. Today we're going to go back to Alyssa Battistoni's Free Gifts, Capitalism and the Politics of Nature, Chapter 5. This is a more interesting chapter in the sense that it diverges to discuss matters of a feminist nature that quite broadly described, and some interesting examples that she uses. Number 5, labor of life, reproduction, and the nature of the human. In 1968, the artist Merely Lederman Euclides had a child. Suddenly, people stopped talking to her about art. She felt that she had become a different class of human being, a mother. In 1969, she wrote the Manifesto for Maintenance Art, challenging art's emphasis on development, innovation, novelty, creativity, and the avant-garde. The manifesto drew attention instead to the processes of preservation and care. Maintenance is a drag. It takes all the fucking time. The mind boggles and chafes at the boredom. The culture confers lousy status on maintenance jobs, minimum wages, housewives, no pay. The manifesto proposed an artwork in 3 parts. First, Euclides would perform within the space of the museum the kinds of maintenance everyday things that she did as a matter of daily life: sweeping, dusting, cooking, changing light bulbs. Second, she would interview a range of workers, asking what they thought maintenance was, how they felt about doing it, how they saw the relationship between maintenance and freedom. Third, she would perform what she called earth maintenance. Each day, containers of refuse would be delivered to the museum. Contents of a sanitation truck, a container of polluted air, a container of polluted Hudson River water, a container of ravaged land. At the museum, they would be rehabilitated and depolluted. The Manifesto for Maintenance Art was one of many efforts in this period in North America and Western Europe to grapple with housework. From Betty Friedan's The Feminist Mystique to Chantal Ackerman's Jean Dielman, 23 Quai du Commerce, 1080 Bruxelles, Alice Childress's Like One of the Family, to the Wages for Housework campaign. The manifesto was informed, too, by growing environmental consciousness, marked by the publication of Silent Spring a few years prior, and culminating in the first Earth Day the following year. In the years that followed, many others would seek to bring feminism and ecology together. In radical feminist texts like Susan Griffin's Woman in Nature and Mary Daly's Guy in Ecology, in movements like the Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp in England, Women's Pentagon Action in the United States, Greenbelt Movement in Kenya, and Chipko Movement in India. But what exactly links these projects? What do feminism and environmentalism, housework, and the earth have to do with each other? On the one hand, the connections are obvious. On the one hand, the connections are obvious. Ideas of the earth as a mother are as ingrained as, and perhaps inseparable from, the idea of the earth as a giver of gifts. Creation mythologies across a range of cultures figure the earth as mother or goddess, even within the Christian tradition of God as father. Pope Francis describes the earth as mother and sister. The botanist Robin Wall Kimmerer writes of the earth as the first among good mothers, which gives us the gift that we cannot provide ourselves. Indigenous Andean movements defend Pachamama, the Earth Mother. Bolivia and Ecuador have legally enshrined the rights of Mother Earth. These associations persist in the tendency, pervasive in classical political economy, to refer to nature with feminine pronouns describing the work she does for free. Even Marx cites the English economist William Petty in claiming that labor is the father of material wealth, the earth is its mother. Human labor, figured as masculine creativity, works on sheer feminine fecundity to produce wealth. The French philosopher Bernard de Fontenelle declared that in 1688 that nature is a great housewife. 3 centuries later, the American ecologist Barry Commoner described ecology as the science of planetary housekeeping. Perhaps more surprising is that similar parallels abound in feminist critiques of capitalism as well. Feminists have frequently drawn analogies between the work done, typically for free, to reproduce the human beings who comprise the laborers, citizens, and other more familiar subjects of political and economic thought, and the contributions of non-human nature to human life and economies. For James O'Connor and Nancy Fraser, both social reproduction and ecology are background conditions for production, echoing Val Plumwood's analysis of backgrounding as the process by which the spheres of reproduction and subsistence are devalued. For Maria Mies and Jason Moore, the work of both women and nature constitutes capitalism's unvalued foundations, whose contributions are freely appropriated. For Marilyn Waring and Nancy Folbury, the contributions of both household labor and ecosystem activity go uncounted and invisible in measurements of economic growth. And yet, from a feminist perspective, these comparisons between the reproduction of human life and the gifts of nature are also vexed. Although ecological and feminist movements emerged simultaneously in the late 1960s and have often seemed to share certain affinities, they have typically adopted radically different stances on the question of nature itself. Ecological thought frequently reminds us that human beings are part of nature, that we ourselves are animals dependent on and unavoidably connected to other kinds of life. The central impulse of contemporary feminist thought, by contrast, is to denaturalize, to reveal that women's oppression is not a biological necessity, but a social convention that can be changed. Feminists have often adhered to Shulamith Firestone's suggestion that feminists have to question not just all of Western culture, but even the very organization of nature. If reproductive labor appears to be a free gift of nature, then feminist critiques of nature pose an uncomfortable question. Why? What exactly unifies ecological activity and reproductive labor as background conditions for maintenance work? Why do these particular activities go unvalued, uncounted, unpaid? After all, ecological processes, say an earthworm's aeration of the soil, are hardly comparable to the gestation of a human fetus, which in turn has little to do with cooking a meal or washing a floor. Why then do they seem to occupy the same position within capitalist societies? Does this analogy serve to reaffirm, however unintentionally, some fundamental link between earthly and womanly fertility? Feminists are conscious of these pitfalls. Most arguments by isomorphism emphasize the social construction of both gender and nature, claiming that both women and nature have been symbolically and ideologically construed as inferior to men and culture. and economically devalued as a result. Women are said to be defined into nature, set in opposition to the male subject. Women's work has been naturalized such that it appears to emerge from women's essential character. Nature itself has been defined as everything that should be free. But these answers simply raise new questions. Who exactly is defining women and nature in these terms, and how have they been so successful? This chapter traces the widespread claim that reproductive labor is devalued because it has been ideologically naturalized to the ideology critique of housework advanced by the Marxist feminist Wages for Housework project, and argues that this analysis fails to offer a convincing explanation for either the low value of reproductive labor or oppression. Gender oppression. What that is, Alyssa calls the naturalization thesis, holds that ideological perceptions of reproductive labor are definitive of its status and value, while frequently losing sight of actual labor processes. This thesis also, notably, says remarkably little about nature itself. Theorists of housework insist that reproduction is labor rather than nature, but they rarely ask why nature can be taken for free, nor, for the most part, do they detail the physical aspects of reproductive labor, the concrete bodily processes involved in the reproduction of life, or the labor activities required to sustain them. Yet, as I argue, attending to the interaction of bodily and labor processes and to their organization within capitalist societies is vital for understanding how and why certain kinds of human labor are perpetually devalued. Understanding the roots of these analogies has implications not only for how we understand the status of reproductive labor within capitalist societies, but how we understand the status of non-human nature. Many now canonical works of ecological thought originated in feminist analyses of the association between women and nature, from Carolyn Merchant's Death of Nature thesis to Val Plumwood's critique of Western dualism. These, in turn, have informed widespread claims in environmental studies about how nature is seen or defined, including Jason Moore's influential argument that capitalism defines nature as cheap in order to better appropriate it. Yet many of these arguments ultimately rest on a similarly unstable account of ideology, that is, one that no more convincingly accounts for the status of nature than it does for the status of housework. The genealogy traced in this chapter, then, illustrates the shortcomings of the worldview approach to the analysis of nature and capitalism outlined in Chapter 1. In its stead, this chapter offers a new account of the oft-noted parallels between human reproductive labor and the free gifts of nature. Rather than analyzing reproductive labor in terms of the woman question that animated earlier analyses, my account focuses on the concrete labor processes associated with these kinds of work, including the bodily processes being reproduced, and asks how they are organized by capitalism. In so doing, it rematerializes labor and denaturalizes its relation to capitalism. It restores attention to labor as a material process involving living human beings while critically assessing the social relations in which these processes take place. Just as non-human life processes often conflict with capitalism's drive toward abstract time and continuous production, as seen in Chapter 3, so too do the temporalities of human life processes. The relationship between human reproductive labor and the free gifts of nature, then, is not merely analogical or isomorphic, but continuous. Both reflect a similar collision of recalcitrant biophysical processes with capitalist social forms and relations. Instead of treating reproductive labor as an inherently distinctive type of activity or sphere of life, one already informed by gender, I understand it as a formal category naming a diverse array of concrete activities unified by their structural position as a remnant of capitalist abstraction. This attention to the significance of life processes, embodiment, and nature itself in reproductive labor might seem to mark a troubling return to biological or biologically essentialist accounts of gender. My goal is the opposite, to attend to the ways that physical and natural processes pertain to forms of specifically human labor without immediately gendering those forms of work. My wager is that an account more narrowly focused on how the physical activities of the concrete labor process relate to capital turn out to be less functionalist and essentializing than one seeks to explain gender itself in relation to either kinds of work or kinds of bodies, as socialist and radical feminisms have often tried to do. Footnote 15. While feminist analyses of the gender division of labor often attended to the embodiment of the laborer, moreover, focusing in particular on the capacity for gestation, it is the body being labored on, the body that is the object of reproductive labor, that is usually of greater significance in the organization of the relevant labor processes. To see reproductive labor as necessarily tethered to bodily processes, finally, does not make it natural rather than social. The body, as Simone de Beauvoir observes, is not a thing but a situation. Its physical capacities gain significance only within particular organizations of human social life. Human reproductive labor, as situated within capitalism, occupies a liminal space. It resists real subsumption, both because it's irreducibly natural, existing in concrete time, structured by biophysical processes, unfolding according to a logic that capital cannot entirely remake or override, and therefore presenting persistent natural barriers to subsumption, and also because it's specifically human, generating a product, labor power, that is distinguished by the capacity of human beings to act in ways that other kinds of beings cannot. Reproductive labor, then, reflects the ambiguity of human labor power, at once part of and connected to the more than human world, while occupying a distinctive position within capitalist societies in particular. The resulting paradox that the activities most vital to human life are often treated as free gifts presents a particularly rich site for interrogating the relationship between labor and capitalism and for orienting our judgments of capitalist value writ large. Theorizing housework, the monotonous repetition of life. Until the late 20th century, perhaps the most sustained consideration of household labor in political thought was to be found in Aristotle's depiction of the oikos as the realm of necessity where women, slaves, and oxen performed the labor required to sustain human life in a sphere governed by despotic norms. Most modern political theorists, including political economists, gave little thought to domestic and reproductive labor, addressing it only in asides. This would change radically in the 20th century as the emergent feminist movement put housework on the political agenda. How exactly housework should be characterized, however, has been hotly disputed. When in the middle of the 20th century, Hannah Arendt described the labor of sustaining life as one of three central activities of the human condition, she echoed Aristotle in seeing it as the least human. One of the conceptual innovations of the Human Condition book of 1958, a book which began as a meditation on and critique of Marx, is the separation of human labor into two categories, each defined by the worldly character of the produced thing, its location, function, and length of stay in the world. What Arendt calls labor is the activity of the animal laborans, the ephemeral, monotonous, and cyclical activity necessary to maintain biological processes from day to day, the thing that tethers human beings to the rest of the living world rather than the thing that sets them apart. Labor, for Arendt, produces nothing but life. It effectively is a stage of biological life, constituting a form of metabolism that does not cease until the organism dies. Although labor is a capricious category, Arendt repeatedly discusses labor in relation to biological procreation specifically, suggesting that fertility is labor in its purest form. It is the category of work for Arendt that is distinctively human, performed by the specifically human tool user, Homo faber, who acts as lord and master of the whole earth to wrench material from nature and make durable objects capable of withstanding nature's unending cycles in order to create a stable setting for the most truly human activity of all, that is, political action. Whereas labor is unending, ceasing only when life is exhausted, work is oriented toward an end with meaning in its own right. Arendt's description of labor finds a surprising echo in a very different text, Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, 1949, which similarly counterposes the monotonous repetition of life to the genuinely human activity of Homo faber. But where Arendt describes features of the human condition writ large, Beauvoir describes their allocation along gendered lines. Women, consigned to the droning repetition of reproduction and housework, are effectively animal laborans, subjected to the species and submissive to nature. Men, who transcend nature through creation, enjoy the status of homo faber. Now, for all the changes that modernity had brought to women's lives, Beauvoir claims the bourgeois Western housewife remained trapped within the realm of necessity and immanence in a liminal space between mere life and human freedom. It is housework, Beauvoir suggests, that most resembles the labor of Sisyphus, who Camus had declared the hero of existential thought, ceaseless and futile. Rather than imagining the housewife happy, however, Beauvoir sought to lay her misery bare. Beauvoir's was the opening salvo in a barrage of work addressing the figure of the housewife, the aspirational figure of white womanhood in the golden age of capitalism. As an emergent feminist movement challenged the gendered order of the post-war settlement, housework became a topic of intense political and economic discussion and analysis. Betty Friedan's feminine mystique famously dismantled the idea that women found housework fulfilling, while radical feminists critiqued gender roles that assigned women to domesticity. Feminist thinkers were also intensely engaged with Marxist thought, both as a methodological model and an object of critique, and many sought to merge Marxist analyses of class with feminist analyses of gender. The radical feminist Shulamith Firestone argued that a material analysis of bodily difference revealed a foundational sexual division of labor, rooted in gestational capacity that constituted women as an oppressed sex class. Socialist feminists challenged the view of the home as a haven in a heartless world and a refuge from a ruthless capitalism, arguing that the home, too, was a place of work. Housework seemed to many to offer a new answer to Marxism's long-standing woman question concerning the relationship between capitalism and women's oppression, one that could root analysis of gender oppression in material conditions without suggesting, per the traditional base superstructure model, that gender was secondary or epiphenomenal to the more foundational problem of class oppression. From these theories, a new account of reproductive labor and its relationship to nature, gender, and capitalism would emerge. Next section, reproducing labor power, where theorists like Beauvoir and Arendt describe the production of life endlessly and changelessly. Marxist and socialist feminists argued that under capitalism, domestic labor produces a unique commodity, that is, labor power. In describing labor power as the aggregate of those mental and physical capabilities existing in the physical form, the living personality of a human being, Marx himself emphasizes the need for its constant renewal. In the course of performing labor, Marx observes, a definite quantity of human muscle, nerve, brain, etc. is expended, and those things have to be replaced. Every day, the laborer sells their labor power to the capitalist. Every day, they must acquire the means of subsistence, adequate food, housing, fuel, and so on, necessary to replenish their body and mind and restore their ability to return to work the next day. Marxist feminists argue that the renewal of labor power also required something Marx had not discussed, that is, forms of unwaged labor, usually performed by the worker's wife. By cooking meals, mending clothes, cleaning house, and tending to sexual and emotional needs, female unwaged houseworkers readied the male waged worker to return to work each day. By gestating and raising children, they produced the next generation of workers. By doing this work for free, they lowered the cost of reproducing labor power, helping to keep wages down. Within this broad framework, theories of housework proliferated. Some followed Firestone's analysis of quote unquote sex class, developing an account of women's subordination rooted in gestational capacity. Others construed women's work within the household as a holdover from a pre capitalist patriarchal or household mode of production that had persisted within capitalism. Now, perhaps the most influential strain of thought, however, both in its own time and in recent feminist revivals, was that advanced by the wages for housework movement. Footnote 19. Wages for housework explicitly pose the woman question as articulated by Maria Rosa Dalla Costa and Selma James in The Power of Women and the Subversion of the Community, 1972, the movement's founding document. Quote, what is the relation of women to capital, and what kind of struggle can we effectively wage to destroy it? And offered the housewife as an answer. By identifying women as an unrecognized proletariat, the housewife offered a way to reconcile feminism's subject question with Marxism's. Drawing on a range of influences from Italian autonomism to dependency theory to the U.S. welfare rights movement, the group Wages for Housework argued that the household was not an archaic institution persisting within capitalism, but an institution specific to capitalism itself. The institution of wage labor had organized social life beyond the direct relationship of capitalist to worker, such that those who didn't earn a wage themselves had become dependent on those who did. As James argued, wagelessness and the resulting dependence on men is the form patriarchy takes under capitalism. Silvia Federici would later diagnose this phenomenon as the patriarchy of the wage. Footnote 32. While wages for housework has been widely invoked, recovered, and analyzed, one of its central features has remained largely unexplored, what I describe as its ideology critique of housework. Wages for housework theorists join thinkers like Betty Friedan, in dissecting the ideology of housework, while rooting its emergence not in society in general, per Friedan, but in capitalism specifically. The ideology of housework, they argued, not only consigned women to the home, it also concealed their true status as workers. Their analysis of housework, therefore, brought the traditional project of Marxist ideology critique, that is, identifying capitalism's distortion of reality and demystifying false appearances in order to awaken class consciousness, to bear on neglected sphere of the household. This, however, would require subtle but significant revisions to the Marxist account of ideology itself. Next section. The ideology critique of housework. The locus classicus of the Marxist theory of ideology is, Stuart Hall argues, the sphere of exchange, where the proletarian and capitalist appear to meet as formal equals and agree to a mutually satisfactory exchange of labor power for a wage. Marx's famous descent into the hidden abode of production is itself an act of ideology critique, intended to reveal the domination and exploitation that lurk beneath the surface ideals of freedom and equality. Here, the wage itself is the vehicle of mystification. It appears to be fair payment for a given amount of work. Which both parties voluntarily agree. If the apparent freedom and fairness of this exchange purport to justify it, however, ideology does not explain why people work in the first place. The doubly unfree status of the worker does that. As Marx notes, proletarians work in order to live. This account is more challenging to apply to the household than it might initially seem. After all, the unwaged housewife doesn't enter into the ideological sphere of exchange at all. So what mystifies work if the wage does not, and capitalists can work in the absence of the wage. The theoretical moves of the wages for housework analysis are best understood as responses to these problems. Wages for housework identify not only the wage, but also wagelessness as tools of mystification and look to the ideology of gender, reinforced by the ideology of nature, to explain why women worked at all. All work is mystified under capitalism. Wages for housework theorists acknowledge, but the ideological status of housework they held is distinctive. Test. Okay. While the wage seems to pay only one person, Dalla Costa and James argued it commands the labor of two, that is, the worker and quote unquote his wife. Where the traditional Marxist critique located ideology in the wage itself, they and subsequent theorists held that the lack of the wage also indexed ideology at work. That is, wagelessness hid housework, rendered it invisible, obscured the length of the working day, mystified the function of the family, and disguised housework's true beneficiary, not only men, but capital. Wagelessness had made housework appear to be a personal service outside of capital, a favor provided by a woman to her husband rather than labor exploited by capital. To explain this seemingly voluntary servitude of the housewife, wages for housework blended the Marxist critique of naturalized social relations with feminist critiques of naturalized gender relations following Beauvoir. What made housework different from other kinds of work, Silvia Federici argued, was the fact that it had been treated as innate to women. It has been transformed into a natural attribute of our female physique and personality, she wrote, an internal need, an aspiration supposedly coming from the depth of our female character. This ideological move served an economic function, Federici charged. Capitalism had gotten a hell of a lot of work almost for free, without which it could not survive. As James would observe, echoing Beauvoir's famous formulation, women are not born housewives, but can only become housewives because we are trained to do it almost from birth. This training effectively created a female role, a servant relation that interpolated all women, whether or not they themselves were actually married, had children, or worked outside the home. If housework was work, then gender was its disciplinary mechanism, backstopped by the authority of nature, the most powerful ideological tool of all. The driving project of Wages for Housework was to attack these mystifications, and its central weapon in doing so was the demand for the wage. Against critics of the movement's economism, Federici was emphatic that the demand for the wage was not only a demand for money, but more importantly, a political perspective that could demystify and subvert the role to which women have been confined in capitalist society. Footnote 42. The wage, Federici wrote, is the demand by which our nature ends and our struggle begins. Because just to want wages for housework means to refuse that work as the expression of our nature, and therefore to refuse precisely the female role that capital has invented for us. Footnote 43. To demand the wage was to struggle unambiguously and directly against the role of the housewife, against its insidious character as femininity, and against its perceived status as a biological destiny. The demand for a wage identified housework as work rather than nature, and thus rendered it an appropriate object of politics. It revealed that other aspects of gender relations, too, were political rather than natural. As one 1977 Wages for Housework poster declared, quote, "We refuse to accept that working for nothing is natural. Depending on a man is natural. Having our wombs and our sexuality controlled by the government is natural." While the political function of the demand for the wage has been widely acknowledged and frequently embraced, its complexity remains underappreciated. The demand targeted three dimensions of ideology simultaneously. First, it sought to denaturalize both housework and the housewife. The wages for housework, theorists argued, would simultaneously make housework visible and demystify femininity, such that both housework and the female role that capital has invented could be refused and work redistributed. Wages were therefore explicitly deployed against housework and implicitly against the housewife as a figure of gendered ideology. Less often noted, however, is the difficulty of using the wage as a tool for demystification, since the wage itself also mystifies. Deployed uncritically, then, the call wages for housework threatens to reinforce the idea that the wage is a fair price for labor, precisely the idea that the Marxist ideology critique challenged and that wages for housework also called into question. It seems, in other words, to fall prey to what William Clare Roberts calls the wage fraud, the perception that wages express the value of labor. In a crucial but largely neglected move, wages for housework framed the demand for the wage as also a struggle against the wage itself and the capitalist relation it embodies. Now, what the demand, wages for housework, discloses, in other words, is that the wage does not reflect the value of labor at all. The demand, then, could potentially mobilize housework against wages. By revealing that wages do not actually pay for a great deal of useful labor, it could call into question the idea that the wage is an accurate measure of work's true value, its social or moral worth. The emancipatory function of the demand for the wage therefore entailed a tricky double move in which the wage must be simultaneously demanded and disavowed. As the complexity of the demand reflects, the wages for housework ideology critique wavered between a focus on the housewife and more broadly gender, housework and more broadly gendered labor, and the wage and its inverse wagelessness. This fluidity could be overlooked when these categories coincided in the figure of the unwaged female housewife. But it has proved more problematic as this analysis has circulated beyond its initial purview. So too have the problems with an ideology critique rooted in the woman question become more glaring as patterns of both gender and labor have changed. In particular, the explanation that reproductive labor is unwaged because it has been ideologically naturalized has become increasingly unstable as the theory has traveled. Next section. Wages for housework beyond the housewife. Theories of housework exploded precisely as the age of the housewife was drawing to a close. The housewife had always been a historically and racially specific figure, as Angela Davis noted, footnote 50. Many analyses of housework noted that even middle-class white women were increasingly working outside the home, especially in the emerging service sector. By the 1980s, the analysis of housework alone seemed increasingly ill-equipped to address the complexity of both labor and gender. Some feminist theories in this period abandoned the framework of housework altogether. Others, however, made the opposite move, extending the wages for housework analysis beyond the housewife per se. Two traditions, housewifization theory and social reproduction theory, have been particularly influential in developing theories of reproductive labor since. Theorists of housewifization drew most directly on the wages for housework ideology critique to explain the persistent wagelessness of a wider variety of work, focusing in particular on peasant women in the third world. Housewifization, the socialist Maria Mies argued, described the process of universalizing the housewife ideology that defined women basically as housewives and sex objects. Housewifization was a strategy for reducing labor costs. When women were defined as housewives, Mies charged the work they did was correspondingly defined as supplementary rather than breadwinning and could be underpaid accordingly. Work that had been housewifized was subject to a set of poor working conditions, ones under which housewives had long labored: job insecurity, low wages, long hours, no labor rights or trade unions. Housewifization theorists argued, moreover, that the housewife's conditions exemplified those under which most people worked, such that the housewife, rather than the industrial proletariat, was the subject with a privileged lens onto the working of the system as a whole. The standpoint of the unwaged housewife offered a new view of capitalism altogether, one in which wage labor was only the tip of the iceberg, beneath which lurked a vast expanse of unwaged labor appropriated by capital, done by housewives and the unemployed, students in the global north and subsistence farmers in the global south. Housewifization theorists also developed the argument, already incipient in Wages for Housework, about the association of women with nature. Women in colonies, Mies claimed, had been defined into nature so that their work could be appropriated freely. The invocation of nature had mystified a gendered relationship of dominance and exploitation. According to the dominant logic of Western capitalism, Claudia von Verhoeven observed, certain people were treated as if they were nature and available gratis, like air. Their work was pronounced to be non-labor. Nature was not only a tool of mystification, but had itself been mystified. Capitalism, Mies claimed, had redefined non-human nature itself as a vast reservoir of material resources to be exploited and turned into profit. Footnote 58. Von Werlhoff similarly argued that capitalism had defined nature simply as everything that should be free or as cheap as possible, and this brilliant ideological achievement had facilitated the appropriation of natural resources. As Mies's pithy formula concluded, the trifecta of women, nature, and colonies constituted the unvalued and appropriated foundations of capitalism, its invisible but necessary underground. Federici herself would increasingly take up similar arguments in later work, arguing that capitalism had identified women and colonized peoples with nature in order to justify and mystify the contradictions built into its social relations. As these metaphors and analogies circulated, however, distinctive arguments blurred into a looser set of associations. An initially fertile exchange among theorists of colonization, the household, and non-human nature gradually solidified into a series of mimetic arguments built on circular reasoning. The unwaged status of work was said to result from the oppressive portrayal of women, while women's subordination was conversely explained as stemming from housework's lack of a wage. Theorists of housework had drawn on accounts of colonial and peasant economies in theorizing housework. In turn, theorists of colonialism and peasant labor drew on arguments about housework. Had the household been colonized, or had wage workers in the internal colony been housewifized? These analogies grew still more tangled with the emergence of a parallel strain of ecofeminist work diagnosing the association between women and nature in Western thought. The historian Carolyn Merchant's study of the scientific revolution argued that the image of the earth as a living organism and nurturing mother had been replaced by a mechanistic image of nature as dead matter to be mastered by the male scientist. In Western culture, the philosopher Val Plumwood claimed to be defined as nature is to be defined as passive, as non-agent, as non-subject, as the environment or invisible background conditions against which the white male subject acts. As eco-feminist perspectives were taken up more broadly, these arguments too looped back on themselves. On the one hand, housewives were intentionally naturalized because capitalism needed their work to be unwaged. On the other, housework was unpaid because it was always ready, associated with women and thus with nature. The association of women with nature itself was at times presented as an ideological trick, and at others a genuine connection rooted in the direct interaction with life that supposedly characterizes women's work. Had women been naturalized or nature gendered? As different arguments flattened into a catch-all explanation, naturalization became the force lurking behind free, cheap, or devalued work. And ideology, the mechanism by which certain kinds of work, whether understood as housework or reproduction, are rendered invisible and unpaid. This expanded ideology critique would in time converge with an expanded account of the labor of social reproduction, developed via a largely separate strain of socialist feminist thought. Social reproduction theory looked beyond the housewife and housework to consider a broader array of sites, processes, institutions, and people involved in the reproduction of labor power, in some instances stretching still further to describe the reproduction of people or life in general. Social reproduction, in Johanna Brenner and Barbara Lassett's oft-cited definition, is an expansive category, describing the activities and attitudes, behaviors and emotions and responsibilities and relationships directly involved in maintaining life on a daily basis and intergenerationally. This work may be organized in several ways, or in various ways, as Evelyn Nakano-Glenn observes, both in and out of the household as paid or unpaid work. As such, it has come to encompass a broad but loosely defined set of activities ranging from the biological gestation of human beings to paid service work to basic participation in social life. Notably, this definition centers on the product of labor. Social reproduction produces labor power and or life rather than things, a distinction echoed in many feminist critiques of both capitalism and Marxism, footnote 68. As naturalization became a catch-all explanation for the devaluation of certain kinds of work, so too, as Lisa Vogel notes, has the category of reproductive labor gradually become more metaphorical than analytical. Invoked to describe low-wage food service jobs alongside unwaged gestational labor, public sector education, and waged cleaning work, the category of social reproduction increasingly strains the limits of conceptual coherence. If food service work can be classified as part of social reproduction, why not paid agricultural work? If homemaking constitutes social reproduction, why not house building? Conversely, why does the highly capitalized field of biotechnology not constitute a form of life making? These ambiguities reflect an imprecision about the boundaries of housework within the Wages for Housework project itself. As one Wages for Housework flyer proclaimed, quote, "We're teachers and nurses and secretaries and prostitutes and actresses and childcare workers and hostesses and waitresses. We have chopped billions of tons of cotton, washed billions of dishes, scrubbed billions of floors, typed billions of words, wired billions of radio sets, washed billions of nappies by hand and in machines." Close quote. This partial list of housework is remarkably broad. The activities it names are waged and unwaged, domestic and industrial, intimate and public. And what ultimately holds them together is the residual mark of the woman question under which they were originally analyzed. Reproductive labor is usually defined according to some combination of three criteria, which typically remain implicit. First, the social identity or classification of those performing labor, that is, women, black women. Second, labor's status under capitalism, unwaged, value producing. And third, the material activity or kind of product generated by labor, that is, labor power or life. While social reproduction is technically a gender-neutral category defined by the product of labor, that is, labor power or life, for example, it often remains implicitly defined in terms of the subject tasked with this kind of labor, that is, women. Similarly, while housewifization ostensibly describes a way of reducing labor costs, it rests on the perception and treatment of people in keeping with certain social categories, women, housewives. The imperative to link the analysis of reproductive labor to the woman question has encouraged the conflation of these distinct categories of analysis, even as historical changes have rendered the relationship between these categories more tenuous than ever. Although the intellectual traditions of social reproduction theory and housewifization theory largely developed on separate tracks, their insights are often combined in contemporary feminist analyses, which employ expansive definitions of reproductive labor and feature the ideology critique of naturalization as the central mechanism by which these kinds of work are rendered invisible and unpaid or underpaid. This increasingly axiomatic argument explicitly contrasts reproductive labor with other kinds of labor, which are presumably recognized and valued rightly, and attributes its mistaken valuation to a distinctive kind of ideological mystification. It reifies a separate sphere of reproduction and its ostensible relationship to both capitalism and gender, casting a wide array of activities in terms of unpaid women's work, regardless of who actually does them or under what conditions. It is precisely in treating reproductive labor as an exception to the rule, however, that this critique tends to obscure the reasons for its persistently low value. Next section. Against the naturalization thesis. The widening of the theoretical aperture described above rightly seeks to capture major changes to work and gender in the past several decades, from changing family structures to global migration to deindustrialization. One of the most significant is in the location and organization of housework itself. Much of the work once done in the private household, from childcare to laundry to food preparation, is now performed for wages in the commercial service sector. Despite a different relationship to the wage, family, and workplace, it's often noted that these kinds of wage labor share many of the characteristics of unwaged housework, namely, that they're poorly paid and socially underrecognized. This raises a new question. Why do these kinds of work remain poorly remunerated even when they are waged, and even when they are no longer done only or even primarily by women? Or as Federici asks, why is producing cars more valuable than producing children? Footnote 72. What I call the naturalization thesis offers an explanation in two parts. Certain activities are naturalized as women's work, such that women are expected to do them for little or no pay, while at the same time certain activities are seen as less valuable because women do them. In other words, it makes two claims simultaneously. One about why women tend to do certain kinds of work, and one about why certain kinds of work are not valued. But the ideology critique developed by wages for housework doesn't function in the same way when reapplied to waged work. An account of ideology developed expressly to extend the critique of waged labor to unwaged work becomes incoherent when applied to categories like social reproduction or reproductive labor, in which waged and unwaged work intermingle. On the one hand, the naturalization thesis relies on a functionalist understanding of gender. Capitalism needs reproductive labor to be free, and thus it is made so by the naturalized ideology of gender. Housework was transformed into a natural attribute rather than being recognized as work because it was destined to be unwaged, Federici declared, explicitly analogizing capital to God. In the same way as God created Eve to give pleasure to Adam, so did capital create the housewife to service the male worker. Footnote 73. In relations, capital seems to act intentionally with the explicit goal of rendering reproduction free. Other analyses of reproductive labor make telling use of the passive voice. Women are defined into nature or are naturalized by an unnamed entity. Women and nature are declared unproductive. But how exactly does capitalism do all of this? How does it so successfully deceive us to the extent that we willingly live in the family orders it requires or express ourselves in the gender presentations it finds useful? This is a familiar problem. Feminists have often argued that accounts of gender rooted entirely in capitalism are unsatisfactory insofar as they grant capitalism extraordinary power to make human social relationships and identities. A claim this strong that capital is making people's own intimate sense of themselves on a global scale demands at least some account of the mechanisms by which ideology operates. It demands, too, an account of what distinguishes capital's treatment of reproductive labor. If capitalism relentlessly commodifies human activity, Why hasn't it commodified housework in particular? It can. Anyway, if capital has the power to make labor free or cheap through ideological mystification, why would it not simply naturalize and thereby appropriate more forms of work? Instead, many accounts of reproductive labor simply gesture to a capital that operates, as Federici describes it, as an omnipotent quasi divine power. The naturalization thesis, however, is also unsatisfactory as an account of labor. It fails to offer a convincing explanation for why certain kinds of labor tend to be poorly paid, even when they're waged. Significantly, the naturalization thesis transforms the justificatory role of ideology into a causal force. Most theorists of ideology acknowledge the former, claiming that ideology disguises domination or makes it palatable. Some, however, argue that the beliefs of the dominant also have causal effects on the constitution of reality. Deployed to explain the low value of waged reproductive work, the naturalization thesis does the latter. It suggests that capital itself is hoodwinked by ideology such that it employs and pays people on the basis of attitudes rather than costs. A claim that implies a substantial and considerably idealist revision of our understanding of capitalism. Now, if ideology can have such strong causal effects in the realm of reproductive labor, after all, it can have nearly any effects, and we should expect them to extend much further. There's an important difference between the claim that because domestic labor or care work is poorly waged and often unpleasant work, it tends to be done by those with the least power in the labor market, frequently subjects of gendered and racial oppression, and the claim that domestic labor is poorly waged because it is done by those who suffer gendered and racial oppression. Similarly, there is a difference between the argument that some people are seen as more suited to certain kinds of poorly paid labor, perhaps because they have been indeed socially trained in certain skills. For example, women are often socialized to be nurturing. And the argument that those kinds of work are poorly paid because the people who typically do them have been defined into nature. In the former, ideology is justificatory. In the latter, it is causal. Where attitudes are afforded causal significance, ideology critique threatens to become a set of just so stories that claim to explain everything and end up explaining little. Tellingly, the causal account of ideology is also directly at odds with the functionalist tendency described above. To see gender as functional for capital implies that gender is a pure or a merely cultural phenomenon generated by the more foundational economic base, which claims that beliefs about gender drive the valuation of labor, suggests that ideology has primacy over the economic. Beliefs about gender drive the valuation of labor suggest that ideology has primacy over the economic. The naturalization thesis, then, is not only unpersuasive as a theory of either labor or gender, but internally contradictory as a theory of both. Next section, naturalization without nature. The naturalization thesis, finally, rests on an unsatisfactory account of nature itself. Perhaps more accurately, it is unsatisfactory by omission. Most feminist analyses of naturalization leave the problem of nature itself altogether unexamined. In seeking to denaturalize women's work, they take for granted that defining people or activities into nature means that they can be freely appropriated, while rarely asking why nature itself is treated this way. These analyses therefore leave intact the underlying division between the free gifts of nature and value-producing human labor, and leave the status of nature within capitalism unchallenged. At the same time, the distinctively physical elements of reproducing human life tend to receive short shrift in accounts of social reproduction. Although theories of reproductive labor often invoke life-making and loosely describe associated tasks, they rarely address the peculiarities of life processes themselves. Where nature is addressed directly in feminist theories of labor, it is nearly always in discursive terms, which analyze how nature is portrayed via images or expressed in culture, how nature is seen or defined. The naturalization thesis thus reflects a broader discursive turn in political and social theory that conceives of nature not as a material force in its own right, but as an idea, concept, or construct deployed in service of social projects. Now, this turn has dominated the study of nature even within environmental studies, and the ideology critique of naturalized housework has directly informed analyses of the relationship between nature and capitalism in particular. The influence of the naturalization thesis on environmental thought is illustrated most clearly by Jason Moore's influential theory of cheap nature, which is exemplary of what I have called the worldview approach to diagnosing capitalism's relationship to nature. While Moore frames his account as a theory of real abstraction, it is better understood as an extension of the ideology critique of naturalization to nature itself, one which develops housewification theories, tentative moves in this direction to underpin a sweeping critique of capitalism. Moore charges capitalism with not only appropriating the unpaid work of both human beings and extra-human natures, but also constituting them as such. The unpaid work of women, nature, and colonies, he claims, echoing Mies, are not merely plundered, but actively created through processes of scientific knowledge making. Efforts to make nature legible through epistemic practices like quantification, Moore argues, should be understood as a strategy undertaken with a goal of securing access to natural resources at low cost. A central tool of this strategy is the ideological power of the Cartesian binary, which privileges society over nature and helps capitalism to code both nature and certain kinds of labor as non-valuable. Moore's account, while illuminating in many respects, suffers from the same problems that plague theories of reproductive labor grounded in the naturalization thesis. To argue that capitalism intentionally defines nature as a free gift, that it actively renders nature cheap, and that it has done so successfully for hundreds of years, attributes to capital remarkable powers of ideological mystification, even genius, spanning both continents and centuries. More broadly, the embrace by feminists of a fully socially constructed view of reproduction and even nature itself is born out of an admirable desire to avoid biological essentialism or natural determinism. Yet it betrays a striking anxiety about the status of physical nature within social theory. As Lena Gunnarsson notes, quote, although denying biology any significance for social matters, it seems to be aimed at putting a final nail in the coffin of biological determinism. The move actually depends on a deterministic notion of the biological, footnote 89. Only if physical phenomena really are decisive, after all, would acknowledging their force constitute determinism. Attending to how bodily processes and capacities operate within particular social orders, by contrast, means attending not only to their sheer physical capacity or to how they are perceived, but also to how they are ordered and organized, in this case by capital. To paraphrase Beauvoir, the situation of the body within capitalism is to be at once life and potential labor power, and to be both subject and object of labor. My wager is that looking more closely at the interaction of life processes with labor processes while detaching the analysis of reproductive labor from the woman question altogether ultimately allows for sharper and more nuanced analyses of both labor and gender. Reproductive labor is difficult to make valuable, I argue, not because it has been ideologically naturalized, but because the physical activities it entails, which are inextricably linked to bodily processes and functions, are difficult to make efficient within a capitalist organization of production. My epistemic provocation here is that understanding reproductive labor requires theorists to take not only the standpoint of the housewife, a la housewifization theory, but that of capital, to consider how and why capital organizes labor as it does. The goal of capital is to reproduce itself by generating profit, not to reproduce a set of gender relations. The former may entail the latter, but it may equally entail what Angela Davis describes as the supersession of a gendered division of labor. Capital, moreover, is neither intentional nor omnipotent in its ability to coordinate social activity in service of accumulation. Indeed, as attention to the service sector shows, certain kinds of labor have proven remarkably difficult to make valuable despite capital's best attempts. Capitalism's failure to pay for reproductive labor, in my account, is incidental rather than intentional, stemming from the disinterested processes of capital investment rather than a plot to keep reproductive labor, in particular, unwaged or a patriarchal commitment to the super exploitation of women. The unwaged status of certain kinds of work reflects capital's abdication of responsibility for them rather than the active construction of their social and cultural meaning. I will stop right here at page 165. Needless to say, we'll come back to this on Monday. And 165 to 178. We should be able to get that done on Monday. I hope this has been interesting for you. She's contrasting a variety of feminist theories, some of which are not well attended to relative to their place in history. That is, often, there's whole groupings of people who have a specific ideology kind of thing that preempts a way of thinking about it materially. So, it has issues that it has to do with bourgeois ideology, petty bourgeois ideology, and ideology critique and all that other stuff. So, what she tries to do, and I say try because I think it requires a little bit more explication, is how is it that that there are some things very specific to social reproduction and bodily reproduction that have certain asymmetries. And it's not to say that wages or work should be proportionate to those asymmetries, but rather the question is much more separated in terms of thinking about capital. And I think that's kind of what the idea here is to be able to talk about capital in a way that does not get tied up with, and I think that's what she's talking about a certain variety of determinism. And, you can argue with me about that in the future. Anyway. I am now returning to